Hello, thank you for showing up,
Hi.
even though we were required. This is a lecture about the alchemical tradition and depth psychology. In this lecture, I will describe the alchemical process as represented in the figure Azoth of the Philosophers, created in 1659 by the German alchemist Basil Valentine. Carl Jung likened the production of the Philosopher's Stone to the individuation process, the process of becoming most oneself. By studying alchemy today, we are initiated into the imaginal realm where the psyche speaks. This is the realm of depth psychology, meditation, and spirituality. As we enter this world, we develop an understanding or intuitive comprehension of the mysterious world of the soul and the great work which is the evolution of consciousness. To begin with, I will recite the Emerald Tablet, which according to most alchemists is the original source for the patterning of the formula of alchemy. This is a representation of the Emerald Tablet. True without error, certain and most true, that which is above is as that which is below, and that which is below is as that which is above, performing the miracles of the one thing. As all things are from one, by the mediation of one, so all things arose from this one thing by adaptation. The father of it is the sun, the mother of it is the moon. The wind hath carried it in its belly. The nurse thereof is earth. This is the origin of all perfection, or consummation of the whole world. Its power is made complete if turned into earth. Thou shalt separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, gently, with much sagacity. It descends from earth to heaven, and again descends from heaven to earth, and combines the powers of the above and the below. So thou hast the glory of the whole world. Therefore all obscurity shall flee before thee. For this is the strong fortitude of all fortitudes, overcoming every subtle and penetrating every solid thing. So was the world created. Hence were all wonderful adaptations of which this is the manner. Therefore I am called Hermes Trismegistus, having the three parts of the philosophy of the whole world. That which I have spoken is consummated, concerning the operation of the sun. The operation of the sun is the operation of alchemy. As I mentioned before, it's likened to the individuation process. The tradition of alchemy is actually shrouded in mystery, but Hermetic tradition says that the Emerald Tablet was written by Hermes Trismegistus perhaps 10,000 or more years ago, and that he is a form of this ancient Egyptian god Thoth, or Tahuti, an ibis-headed god who invented writing, magic, and alchemy. The name Hermes Trismegistus may also be a nom de plume for a current, or for authors who are following a mystical tradition. So if someone would write about Hermetic philosophy or alchemy, they would call themselves a Hermes. This tradition, the Hermetic tradition, occurred between the 1st and 4th centuries AD, although it may be much older. Hermeticism included alchemy as part of its tradition, which also included theurgy and astrology. As I mentioned before, alchemy is known as the operation of the sun. The Egyptian origin of alchemy seems to be evidenced within its very name, alchemy. Chem is the Egyptian word for black and was used by Egyptians to represent their nation. It also represents the dark matter or the black soil of the Nile, which was sacred to Isis, and is also symbolic of the primal material, the dark stuff, the matter that the alchemists work with to transmute lead into gold. According to Marie-Louise von Franz, the most ancient alchemical text that we have is a papyrus titled The Words of the Prophetess Isis to Her Son. She states that it is most likely from the 1st century or the Hellenistic period of Greece. At the same time period, the Hermetic tradition, a syncretic tradition which combined Greek and Egyptian traditions, was thriving. Although we have no evidence, many texts are collections of much older sayings, which point to an older tradition. The Arabs, or the Islamic world, took over Egypt at some point and preserved and developed this esoteric art, actually bringing in their own flavor. Later, in the 10th century, it was brought back to Europe when Christianity met Islam. In this presentation, I will use the 17th century image by the German alchemist Basil Valentine to describe the alchemical process as it was understood in Europe. Like depth psychology, alchemy is a science of the art of the soul, which attends to the concerns of the soul by attending to the inner life in pursuit of guidance and transformation. We seek to listen to that still small voice within, to follow its guidance, to see how the pains and wounds, how the joys and tragedies of life help to create the person we're meant to be. Both traditions seek to not just observe the unconscious, but to participate with it and aid the work of the evolution, not only of the self, but of the world of which we are a living part of. Alchemy was a metaphor or myth that Carl Jung, father of depth psychology, found quite important to his whole life. He felt that there was a link between the history of the unconscious, that here was a link between the history of the unconscious and the future of psychology. In fact, he even felt that one could check one's understanding of one's own dreams or the psychic processes in their clients by observing alchemical material, kind of as a way to check on our understanding of the soul. He found that many of their experiences were similar to his own, and that some of the symbols found in alchemical artwork showed up in his and his patients' dreams. In Memory, Dreams, and Reflections, he marked that I had very soon seen that analytic psychology coincided in the most curious way with alchemy. The experiences of the alchemists were my experiences, and their world was my world. Carl Jung, in his writings, actually introduced alchemy to the modern world, and thus has preserved this Western mystery tradition, not just for depth psychology, but for individuals who seek to understand themselves. Other depth psychologists, such as Edward Edinger and James Hillman, also speak about how important alchemy is today. Hillman talks about developing a metaphoric style of consciousness, one that might be more useful than the medical model. For example, one could say one is going through a solutio, a dissolution process, rather than a major depression. That their tears are the dew that emerges as they work through their sorrow. This type of language communicates more about a personal experience than a simple label used to diagnose a condition. Edinger explains that when we familiarize ourselves with the images of alchemy, we familiarize ourselves with the unconscious, with the way that it speaks to us, because the language of the unconscious is the language of symbols. And that we also become acquainted with these age-old archetypal movements of soul. Both Jung and Edinger liken the alchemical process of creating the philosopher's stone to the individuation process of becoming a more conscious and integrated human being. Jeffrey Raff in Jung and the Alchemical Imagination states that the alchemical art and its allegories are the drama of our own souls, playing out the individuation process on the wheel of life. Let's see. Oops. Okay. The process for creating the philosopher's stone, or the awakened self, as psychologists view it, is elaborated in this diagram published by Basil Valentine in 1659. It is titled The Azoth of the Philosophers. The Hermetic alchemists use such diagrams as meditation aids to transform themselves into living stones, working with the imagination instead of chemical apparatus. The word Azoth, the title of this image, is actually a word that represents the work and the philosopher's stone itself. It contains the letters A through Z. The off in Azoth is actually like a Z for the Z. So it's actually a word that contains the end, the beginning and the end of the work, the alpha and the omega, the prima materia and the completed stone. The face in the center is where the alchemist would gaze as he or she is meditating upon this image, thus uniting their imagination with these images and beginning a process of transformation. Here we have some keys into what it means to perform the great work, to balance the four elements of one's being, or the four functions. We have the body of the alchemist, standing upon water and earth, holding a torch of fire and a feather for air. The king and the queen here represent the thinking function and the feeling function, the consciousness and the unconscious, extroversion and introversion. The salamander up on top represents the fiery extroverted energy of the king, which causes us to rise to heaven. And the eagle itself, which seeks its prey in the depths of the ocean, represents the downward movement of the soul, which finds within the hidden depths the treasures that the queen seeks. In the center, if you will notice, there's a winged caduceus. The winged caduceus represents integrated consciousness and also transcendent awareness. The knob at the top between the two wings is actually a representation of the pituitary gland, which at that time period they thought was the seat of consciousness. In alchemy, we work upon ourselves and our souls to realize our hidden potential, which Paracelsus called the hidden star in man. Every man and every woman is a star. Each of us individually, uniquely adds to this universe. We are like a star in a company of stars, in the constellation of the universe. And we are here to seek, to find what gift we have to give life, and how that gift actually causes life to continue onward. If you notice, so here we have the alchemical process described in this wheel. So from the body, let's see if I have a better image here. Oh, actually, well, okay. So anyways, oh yeah, so I wanted you to notice the 7 points of the star. And that a 7-pointed star is actually sacred to Venus, denoting that this is a work of love. For without love, without some higher inspiration, it's going to be an operation of the ego. And so we have here represented in the 7 points of the star, 7 stages, successive stages of the alchemical process. Calcinatio, solutio, separatio, conjunctio, fermentatio, sublimatio, and coagulatio. Between each of the points is actually a word, which represents also something about each one of these stages. Visita, meteora, terra, rectificando, and venius, occultum, lapidum, which I'll explain what it means later. As I mentioned, each point represents one of the 7 stages. So let's go through these stages. The first stage is calcinatio, and we have the word visita, which means to visit. So here we begin our journey, and we begin to visit the great mystery. Here we have a star, the point of the star is colored black, the color of death. The sigil for Saturn, the planet of death and limitation. And the salt, that's which dissolves and is possibly reconstituted. Here we are challenged to die to an old way of life and to begin a new one. The only way to visit this process is first to die. So therefore this stage, calcinatio, represents death of the profane or death of the ego. It is the beginning of the black stage where we are reduced to our most basic components. The image in the circle here shows a black crow perched on top of a skull, representing death of the ego. Chemically, calcination represents heating up a substance until it was reduced to ashes. If you can just imagine your ego being reduced to ashes, this is the kind of process that happens. Also, one note about salt. Salt is a crystalline, perhaps rigid structure. So, however, in this process, it is going to be broken apart. So it's our own crystallized attitudes and attachments that are going to be challenged to die in this stage. Psychologically destroying the ego's hold over one's life and its defenses is what we're working on here. Actually, so that was 1. Now here's 2. This second stage is intiora, solutio, or dissolution. And we have the word intiora, which represents the interior, or the inner world. So here in this work, we're going to go within. Here in the stage of solutio, we're going to be dissolved in the inner content of the psyche, the inner world of images and feelings that were previously possibly repressed, but released from the first process.
Scott, I'm sorry, is it possible to enlarge that again?
Sir.
Oh, yeah.
Sir.
Sir, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Dr. Gilliam?
Oh, that's much better.
Okay, yeah.
That's
So here on the second ray we have the colored white, which connects with the color for Jupiter and for tin. Now Jupiter is a planet of wealth and riches, material wealth and material riches. So it can represent a material attitude towards life. And in Dennis William Hawke's book on alchemy, he also said that the tinny personality is a superficial personality. It's someone who doesn't really have much depth. So this process is one of creating greater depth by immersing oneself in the inner world, the intiora of our existence. This could also mean awakening up to the world of our dreams. In this process, we are releasing the buried emotions, showing our pain and wounds where the gold is trapped. Basically, all of the ways that we hold our feelings and fears and complexes at bay are becoming dissolved so that in the unconscious we can transform. The image in the circle shows the black soul bird watching a white image of itself, the spirit, emerge from this process of dissolving the ego. Chemically, solutio is a dissolving of the ashes produced by the previous stage in water or acid. Psychologically, it's breaking down further the ego and its complexes, immersing in the unconscious, irrational, or rejected shadow aspects of ourselves. Okay, so the next stage is coming up here. Okay.
Perfect.
Separatio. Here we have the word terra, which means earth. Here we're dealing with separating the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross. After we've dissolved, our product we need to discern what has been produced and what is worthy of continuing onward in work. Here we're dealing with our earth, our body, our rigid and fixed aspects, separating. Anything that hasn't been dissolved or completely transformed needs to be thrown away, needs to be removed, so that we can continue on this process. So the process of separatio, interestingly enough, is red. We have the symbol for sulfur and for Mars, willful aggression, the iron temperament. Iron is a planet of Mars. Red relates to courage and fearlessness, and sulfur represents a process of intense devotion and also sustained fiery will. It's the sustained fiery will, it's the courage that we need to produce the separatio, to actually go in there and to cut off the parts of ourselves that don't fit in this process. So as I mentioned, the refined parts are separated from the earthy when we use the power of Mars to actually activate this process. In the image of the circle, we have the black earthbound soul bird split into two white birds that descend to retrieve the saved remains of calcinatio and dissolution. Discerning what is worthy of being saved, and also retrieving the frozen energy that is released from breaking down complexes in the previous stages. Chemically, the isolation of components of dissolution are done by filtration or settling, discarding unworthy material. Psychologically, we're letting go of self-inflicted restraints on our true nature, the ways that we repress different parts of ourselves to provide a more appropriate image to others. Here we're saving the hidden essence, throwing away the idea of being the actor on the stage, but being a truly authentic person. The next stage, which many people think is the last stage, is conjunctio. And what's interesting is that conjunctio, we notice we have the symbol of the sun, and here it's represented as green, as being the green, the life-giving force of the sun. The sun causes the green of the earth to rise. And the sunny temperament sometimes could be someone who's too positive or optimistic or idealistic. And when they reach this stage, this wonderful, glorious stage of connecting with the self, they feel like, I've made it. My work is done. But this is just the turning point of the work. So it's important to realize that sometimes we might stop halfway when we reach a comfortable ledge in the work. But there's more refining to do. There's more work to do to make this state a permanent, solid state in our lives, an actual stone. In conjunctio, we are creating a harmony or balance between the opposites and achieving an integration or conjunction. The fourth ray is green for the life-giving sun, and the metal gold. And the golden temperament is also where feeling and intellect are balanced. So here we're achieving a state where the feeling function and the thinking function actually are operating together, where the king and the queen actually are in converse. And actually the images for this state are those of the king and the queen making love and giving birth sometimes to a magical child. So this is the body and the soul reunited, the king and the queen engaged in the hierogamos, the sacred marriage. The image in the circle shows the birds of soul and spirit as raising up a five-pointed crown, represented the retrieved quintessence. That's the fifth element, released through this process. This also celebrates the birth of the philosophical child, which the alchemists called the crude hermaphrodite. It is a child who has both male and female qualities, but is also just beginning to live, not quite able to walk on its own, not quite able to live outside the container. So we have to continue the work. Psychologically, in this stage, we have also the awakening of intuitive insight or understanding, the intelligence of the heart. That's why this is called a turning point, because here we actually contact the self and we actually unite the self and the soul together enough to actually start to have an intuitive understanding of ourselves and our world. We've gone beyond the world of normal intellect and of ego to one of actually listening to that still small voice that we are releasing in this process. Okay, so the next stage, very interesting stage, fermentatio. Here we have the word inwenius. Oh, pardon me. In the previous stage we had the word rectificando, which represents setting things right, rectification. So it's kind of interesting to notice that it's kind of the middle point and the top point of the circle. Very important place to be, but only halfway through the process. So in fermentatio, well, our product ferments. It goes through a process of just sitting and waiting. Inwenius, we're waiting to discover. Inwenius means to discover. And in this stage, we're patiently waiting to discover what the product will look like. And a lot of things happen to us in this stage. Here we have new insights that occur because we've opened up. Our ego has, kind of like the egg of our ego has cracked open to include the more all-inclusive worlds of the soul and of the spirit. We've also invited in the imagery of the unconscious. Here, new insights occur as they flood in inspirations from the inner world through that unconscious into our awakened consciousness. This is the process of the peacock's tail, where many different colors and mystic visions can occur. It shows that we have actually penetrated to the other side, to the inner life, and we have created a conduit where it can actually move back and forth between ourselves and that other that we're seeking to make permanent in our lives. The fifth ray is green and relates to, and the symbol is that of Venus and of copper. Well, green is the color that copper makes when it corrodes. And it represents, it basically is kind of a symbol for this process itself. There's this becoming crystalline of these different structures. It's like, we're almost like rotting in a sense, but it's more of a ripening. And in this ripening process, the green of the copper comes forward. That which we previously couldn't see comes forward for us to experience. Venus represents the cupric temperament, someone who is attracted and devoted to the work, and who operates from a place of love. It also represents a person who is ruled by desire. So we want to make sure that our desire continues to work along the process of individuation. We don't get hung up in any of the earlier stages. We're continuing forward to continue the work that we achieved in the conjunction. So the product of the conjunction is ripened, producing colorful visions and flooding the mind with images, indicating that one has penetrated into the deep realms of the imagination, the inner world where symbols are actually alive. Here we know that we have almost made it to the end of the work because we are being visited by living symbols and images that show up in dreams or waking visions. The image in the circle shows two birds, the soul and spirit birds, resting in a tree of knowledge, brooding over an egg. They're just waiting for the divine event to occur, the completion of the work. Raising the results of the conjunction to a new level of being, hatching a new level of consciousness, is what we're doing here. The magical child's matured and ripened. This stage initiates the personality into a new life. The next stage is sublimatio. And here, sublimatio relates to the phrase in the Emerald Tablet, it rises from earth to heaven and again descends to earth. So we have the sense of the material basically rising and descending in the vessel. Chemically, distillation is the boiling and condensation of the fermented solution. So we actually have kind of a literal symbol of that movement. The sixth ray points to the feather, by the way, and so it means that we're spiritualizing, making more airy, making less solid the material in our container. The image in the circle shows a unicorn lying on the ground in front of a rose bush. What's interesting is that the unicorn runs tirelessly from anyone who tries to capture it in mythology, except for the virgin. Well, the virgin is the purified alchemist. So here, what we're doing basically is a final purification. Chemically, distillation is boiling and condensation of the fermented solution. And psychologically, this agitation and sublimation of psychic energy occurs to remove any last purities from the ego and the id, so they're not incorporated in the final product. Finally, we have coagulatio, the coagulation, the final forming of the philosopher's stone. The making perfect of a state, the making permanent, like a stone, the level of consciousness that we've reached in the conjunctio. That's why it's called a stone, because it's solid, because it's eternal. It's also said that we achieve the immortal body in this stage. The immortal body simply means that we participate in that other realm, which is timeless and eternal. Here the stone, the awakened state from the conjunction, is made fixed or solid, and as Gerhard Dorn says, from dead stones we become living stones, the emblem of the work itself. The seventh ray is purple, representing the color of royalty. And here we have the symbol for silver and for the moon. Mirrors of old were made of silver. Here we are learning how to be a mirror of the cosmos itself, a microcosm who reflects the full macrocosm. Here we are complete, with intuitive knowledge, balancing our previous rational knowledge. Intuitive knowledge is lunar and that of the moon. In this final stage, the distilled essence is brought back to earth, forming the stone, and coagulation incarnates and releases the ultimate material of the soul, which in the Hermetic tablet means the glory of the whole world. Chemically, the distillates are recondensed into a solid, which is the philosopher's stone, and psychologically, the emergence of new life as a permanent state of being is represented by a new attitude or perspective that's fuller, deeper, and richer, and more reflective of the whole personality rather than the ego's more limited perspective. Finally, notice that here we return to our beginning. We're returning to earth. We've ascended the mountain, and we've come back down to earth, integrating the above and the below, so we can bring our inspiration back to the world. So notice how this is a wheel, the wheel of individuation. Carl Jung would say that mandalas or wheels were always symbols of the self, and that when they showed up in a person's dream, it meant they were trying to integrate something, or possibly an integrative process was happening. Well, that's exactly what we're doing in alchemy. We're dissolving and coagulating. Solve et coagula, two principles which represent dividing and then remembering. The body of Osiris, which represents the body of the self that travels through the underworld. That's beyond the ego because it lives below as well as above. So the phrase itself, visita interiora terra rectificando invenius occultum lapidem, means visit the innermost parts of the earth. By setting things right, you will find the hidden stone. It also represents the most important chemical, one of the first chemicals used in the work, which is vitriol, V-I-T-R-I-O-L. Vitriol is a fiery liquid substance, which may actually represent an acid, as well as I believe represents possibly the kundalini, which is what rises in spiritual and mystical experiences, and quite possibly the libido needed to start the work, and then that which is released during these processes to continue moving the process of transformation. Performing the great work or simply studying it is useful in many ways. By contemplating these images, we enter the imaginal world of the psyche and develop some sense of a greater intuition. We take the journey to further immerse oneself in this process. We may even find it helpful in producing a positive transformation. It is also useful to become acquainted with these images for those of you who are therapists who might want to understand better one's clients' dreams or fantasies. My own studies and meditations on these images have helped me to grow as an individual and a therapist. I've come to understand my own complexes in a new light as I meditate upon them while contemplating these images. As I have become more familiar with alchemical symbolism, my soul has begun to use them to speak to me as they emerge from my dreams and visions. Finally, I believe, as a result, I have grown in intuition, or inner standing, as the modern scholar of alchemy, Stanislaus Wysowski de Rolla, calls it. My experiences with alchemy have helped me work with my clients in many ways. I've become more adept at getting the feeling of what an image or sequence of images may be communicating. I'm more able to sense movements of soul when there's a presence of the other in the room. And when I fantasize about my clients' processes and reflect upon what they're going through, I sometimes find that it actually fits within one of these 7 compartments, or certain sequences within the process of the alchemical creation of the Philosopher's Stone. In this way, my intuition has begun to reveal to me, and my client's own soul has begun to reveal to me, new ways of understanding and working with the clients, and become a type of Hermes psychopompus itself. Since delving into this imagery and language of alchemy, I've had dreams with philosophical eggs that need to be moistened or are too dry, visions of roosters and crows heralding rebirth and death, and a hypnagogic version of sulfur and mercury united. I found that I was truly working through the alchemical art, being gifted with these new symbols. These experiences have enriched and guided my own personal work. For example, I had a solutio dream when I grappled with alcoholism and recovery, and later I discovered that alcoholism is actually a pathology associated with the stage of solutio. As a result, this dream has actually provided guidance for many, many years. By immersing myself in alchemy and depth psychology, uniting this ancient art with modern psychology, I realize that they are seeking the same thing, the growth of awareness. As a result, I feel that I have received guidance from my own self in a way that has enriched my life. Through this process, the prima materia, my own leaden existence, has been illumined, beginning the transformational process which produces the stone of the wise and the golden temperament of a fully individuated being. As Hillman points out, this ancient part of our heritage is relevant today. It's an alternate way of understanding our psyche and speaking about our souls. Depth psychology, like alchemy, seeks to follow this individuation process which incarnates and drives us through life, seeking to become more aware and awake human beings of the one world itself of which we are living components of. By acquainting oneself with the images of alchemy, you can increase your own personal communication with your unconscious, begin your own individuation process, and enrich your work with clients. The study of alchemy is both fascinating and fruitful, for it can transform your own relationship in the unconscious and your work with your clients. Thank you. So this is kind of at the end of the work itself. When I mentioned we come down from the top of the mountain. Well, the end of the Hermetic work is known as apotheokosmosis, which means that we become a living part of the universe itself. And here I kind of see this image as representing us first entering the imaginal world and also kind of maybe finding our place in it. Joel,
Scott, could you just repeat the translation of these words? Visit the innermost parts of the earth, set aright.
yeah. Unless I can read it. Let's see. Visit the innermost parts. Okay, yeah. Visit the innermost parts of the earth by setting things right and rectifying them. You will find, or discover is probably better, the hidden stone. The reason I say discover is because this is a collaborative process with the psyche itself. It's not an ego-driven process.
Can you zoom that up so we can have a better look?
Sure. Yeah, I really like this. This really... Jacob Bohm says that magic itself is the penetration of the imagination to the great mysteries. And I think this kind of says it. And that's one thing, that depth psychology and alchemy and Western mysteries holds in common. They're courting the imagination.
Another question, sorry.
Sure.
In the stages, the conjunctio, either the conjunctio stage or the sublimatio stage, which seem to be touching the very heart of soul, self, I'm wondering, does the shadow, does it diminish? Because it seems like you still have to go through from Mentadio and what happens then in sublimatio? Do you then lose the shadow? What happens to the shadow?
That's a really good question, because I think we kind of have to back up and make sure that we're using a metaphor, and that this is psychologically a process that we continue going through and through and through and through. But in sublimatio, yes, we're basically further refining, distilling the essence, so that we're at least not identified with the part of ourselves that doesn't want to accept the shadow, but identified with the part of ourselves that can welcome that shadow. And I think that's why the work continues. It's like, well, you're not perfect yet, and you never will be. But I think this kind of connects with the idea that wholeness doesn't mean perfection, but means completeness. And I think it's being completely, uniquely who you are meant to be, which is kind of how Jung talked about individuation. Any questions, please?
Do you think that, so you mentioned that we go around, sort of like we go around and around, rather than...
Yeah, well, we're talking about the individuation process. When we talk about this in conjunction with the individuation process itself, I think we have to kind of use the wisdom and knowledge of depth psychology to complement what they may have done. From what I understand, in spiritual alchemy, which is different than material alchemy itself, although they were originally performed together, all of the stages could work together and overlap each other, and they could also be a repetition of the stages. The individuation process itself is a living, moving, dynamic process that I imagine if you go through this process once, you maybe gone through your great initiation, where you've been really, realized shadow elements, that there is a shadow. You realize that there are parts of me that are repressed and that there's something else than my old attitude. So that's maybe the first turn around the wheel, and that could be a complete process. But Carl Jung always says, and I think most Jungian psychologists, most depth psychologists say that the individuation process is continual, and it continues through the rest of our lives. So I think, in a sense, probably in the beginning, it's like the sweat and toil of initiation that really is much more dramatic and painful. And then as we go through it, we'll probably learn how to submit to the process, continuing onward.
Just on a slightly different shift, because you're so clearly informed and connected to this material, the alchemical material, and I think of depth psychology as a lens, through which we see life and make it meaningful. Or you could use spirituality or Christianity or any of that stuff. And I'm curious on a personal level, how your experience of using or embodying alchemy informs your life. How does it feel to be seeing life through an alchemical lens?
Oh, well, yeah, I was kind of alluding to that, but thanks. I'll explain a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because as I said, I haven't formally worked through the alchemical process in a sequence over a certain amount of time, although that I have worked with these images and these processes symbolically in many different ways. And to answer your question, I say that, well, it's helped me to realize that the shitty, reeking aspects of my life are important. The primal material itself actually, and the stone are really the same thing, just at different stages of transformation. So I've learned to appreciate that all parts of my life, even the painful ones, have meaning. And that I think my own judgments, my own ego judgments about what's right or wrong or appropriate or not become more dissolved, looser, more flexible. So I've kind of allowed myself to see how it all fits in within a sense of my wholeness or individuality. So it's released me from the curse of perfectionism. And, and I think maybe of wanting to stay at that one stage where it seems all like we're all perfect in light, but we got to come back to earth. We've got to embody this in a very human way, of course, because our uniqueness is the key. So it's helped me to really appreciate uniqueness, to appreciate my clients as well. That their lopsided parts are all important, beautiful aspects of this process. And it hasn't gotten me into a place where I'm looking at the end result or the goal. I'm looking more at the full process itself. That this is a movement that is representative of a movement of life, because collective unconscious images tend to reflect kind of truths that we all share, kind of components of life that we all experience.
Can you tell me how you see Sophia informing alchemy for you?
Well, the philosophers, people who practice alchemy would call themselves philosophers.
Mm-hmm.
The philosopher is a lover of Sophia. And well, it's basically a process of ingesting living symbols, of going through this process and identifying with these different images and aspects of ourselves until we may become pregnant. So that our body, our subtle body itself, our imagination becomes pregnant with these images. And so we're giving birth to wisdom. So for me, it is very much about uniting with the goddess Sophia. And being in relationship to her and embracing a embodied, living, interior process that actually gives birth to life and that reminds us where we came from, which is Sophia. Yes.
You mentioned that this was done around 1659. Do you have any idea historically about what time frame this picture or this?
I don't know. I don't know. You know what, though? Actually, I think it is in the same time period. There's a lot of alchemical images that seem to come out of the 17th century. I think that's the time period that Jung really found really interesting. But it's probably around the same time period.
Okay. One thing I love about that picture is if you look at it closely, you might all want to go up and look at it. What he's actually doing is his head is poking into something that looks much more mechanical.
Yeah, that's because their vision of that's the.
And I just have always wondered about that picture, whether it's a representation in advance of the way in which our perception of the world has become desouled and has become mechanical. It's really all about gears and levers that move things.
Though, I think that from a certain perspective we could go there, but no, because this is sometime between the Renaissance and 1700s, and at that time, they kind of had this feeling. You had the orbits of the spheres, you have the planets, you have these different progressive levels of the planets and eventually the monads. So basically, I think what this represents is penetrating from the more astral sense of being in our individual imaginative dream world, actually penetrating into the world of the divine and of the fiery heavens. But you could definitely go there too. But culturally, for where they were at,
Yeah.
this represented actually penetrating through the imagination to the real.
But see, that's the whole point, is that that's the making of the world mechanical has been very numinous. We wouldn't have gone there as a culture if it wasn't more numinous than where we've been. It drew us in to imagine that there were these cogs and these explanations.
It went so bad though. Thank you, because we're kind of on the other side of that now.
Right.
It's like two triangles like this.
The next picture would be of the poor guy, way out at the other end of the top of that.
Trying to get back.
Trying to get back. Well, what's that beyond even that? Imaginally might be yet another synthetic vision of what's coming out there somewhere.
Yeah, to me, just from a feeling sense, this is someone who's learned how to enter in the other realm of the imagination. And when you identify different parts of your personality, of your living experience of life with these occult symbols, these things are like living beings who come and visit you, and they're parts of you. So it's a little bit, it can be a little schizophrenic kind of, there's a little sort of a kind of psychotic element to it, in a positive way, I think.
Very good. Very nice.
The last thing I want to say about that is that I think that's really the creation, not just the creation, but the invocation of the genius, because the genius itself represents the angel, so we're pulling it down, but we're also creating it. Because each of us is a genius and has a genius in our uniqueness.
Wow.
All right, same process, please. Evaluation of Scott, and please hand the evaluation to class when you're through.
Oh, what did I do that? Just escape it. I brought a timer, but I think I'll just deal with the clock like everyone else is. It's fine. So does everyone have? No. Yeah.
No, not yet. It's coming. Scott, do you plan to integrate Q&A, or do you want us to give you a time
Yeah. So at the end of the 40 minutes Q&A.
Q&A at the end of the 40
Right.
minutes? Great.
Yeah. Afterwards.
All right. I will be your timekeeper.
Hello. Thank you for showing up.
Hi.
Even though we were required. This is a lecture about the alchemical tradition and depth psychology. In this lecture, I will describe the alchemical process as represented in the figure Azoth of the Philosophers, created in 1659 by the German alchemist Basil Valentine. Carl Jung likened the production of the Philosopher's Stone to the individuation process, the process of becoming most oneself. By studying alchemy today, we are initiated into the imaginal realm where the psyche speaks. This is the realm of depth psychology, meditation, and spirituality. As we enter this world, we develop an understanding or intuitive comprehension of the mysterious world of the soul and the great work which is the evolution of consciousness. To begin with, I will recite the Emerald Tablet, which according to most alchemists is the original source for the patterning of the formula of alchemy. This is a representation of the emerald tablet. True without error, certain and most true, that which is above is as that which is below, and that which is below is as that which is above, performing the miracles of the one thing. As all things are from one, by the mediation of one, so all things arose from this one thing by adaptation. The father of it is the sun, the mother of it is the moon. The wind hath carried it in its belly. The nurse thereof is earth. This is the origin of all perfection, or consummation of the whole world. Its power is made complete if turned into earth. Thou shalt separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, gently, with much sagacity. It descends from earth to heaven, and again descends from heaven to earth, and combines the powers of the above and the below. So thou hast the glory of the whole world. Therefore all obscurity shall flee before thee. For this is the strong fortitude of all fortitudes, overcoming every subtle and penetrating every solid thing. So was the world created. Hence were all wonderful adaptations of which this is the manner. Therefore I am called Hermes Trismegistus, having the three parts of the philosophy of the whole world. That which I have spoken is consummated, concerning the operation of the sun. The operation of the sun is the operation of alchemy. As I mentioned before, it's likened to the individuation process. The tradition of alchemy is actually shrouded in mystery, but Hermetic tradition says that the emerald tablet was written by Hermes Trismegistus perhaps 10,000 or more years ago, and that he is a form of this ancient Egyptian god Thoth, or Tahuti, an ibis-headed god who invented writing, magic, and alchemy. The name Hermes Trismegistus may also be a nom de plume for a current, or for authors who were following the mystical tradition. So if someone would write about Hermetic philosophy or alchemy, they would call themselves a Hermes. This tradition, the Hermetic tradition, occurred between the 1st and 4th centuries AD, although it may be much older. Hermeticism included alchemy as part of its tradition, which also included theurgy and astrology. As I mentioned before, alchemy is known as the operation of the sun. The Egyptian origin of alchemy seems to be evidenced within its very name, alchemy. Chem is the Egyptian word for black and was used by Egyptians to represent their nation. It also represents the dark matter or the black soil of the Nile, which was sacred to Isis, and is also symbolic of the primal material, the dark stuff, the matter that the alchemists work with to transmute lead into gold. According to Marie-Louise von Franz, the most ancient alchemical text that we have is a papyrus titled The Words of the Prophetess Isis to Her Son. She states that it is most likely from the 1st century or the Hellenistic period of Greece. At the same time period, the Hermetic tradition, a syncretic tradition which combined Greek and Egyptian traditions, was thriving. Although we have no evidence, many texts are collections of much older sayings, which point to an older tradition. The Arabs, or the Islamic world, took over Egypt at some point and preserved and developed this esoteric art, actually bringing in their own flavor. Later, in the 10th century, it was brought back to Europe when Christianity met Islam. In this presentation, I will use the 17th century image by the German alchemist Basil Valentine to describe the alchemical process as it was understood in Europe. Like depth psychology, alchemy is a science of the art of the soul, which attends to the